So, before I walked into the theater to watch the Dark Tower film, I was primarily worried about one thing. It wasn't the casting. It wasn't the obvious changes that the storyline would have. It was the time of the movie. I was a little bit worried about the fact that the film was going to be only 90 minutes long, which is a bit short for action movies these days. Most action movies you see today tend to be around 2 hours to 2.5 hours long, depending on how much story they want to put in there. And have this movie coming out based on this really lengthy series of books. To have this only 90-minute film based on it just seemed a little bit odd to me, especially considering the amount of source material they could have covered. It wasn't actually until after I watched the movie that I discovered that it's actually PG-13, which is another warning sign for me. That a movie studio is kind of creating a movie to kind of placate to the most common audience. They're not necessarily worried about translating the story, they're worried about how much money they're going to recuperate. That said, I try to keep an open mind. The preview looked pretty cool. I like the casting. Idris Elba is always good. Matthew McConaughey. Ever since things like True Detective, Interstellar, he's kind of reshaped an image for himself that actually shows that he's actually an amazing actor. So I had my hopes up. And then come the Friday of release, I still hadn't watched the movie. Already hearing the bad reviews coming in from Rotten Tomatoes. Although the thing to consider about Rotten Tomatoes is it doesn't really give you a quality score. It's more of a popularity score. So like 19% of the critics liked it. So I still had hopes up that at the very least it might be okay. And as a film, if you disconnect the film from the books, if you don't consider the books, it is okay. It is mediocre at best overall. It's got its moments. It's not entirely bad. There are movies that are entirely bad. This one does have its moments, and the action in it is actually pretty cool when it actually lets itself have action. The acting from both Idris and McConaughey, great. The production value is top-notch. What the movie suffers most from is trying to tell a condensed and separate story, like an abridged version of several books, while also cutting out parts and mixing in other parts. It doesn't really work quite well as a story, but it is watchable. If it's I wouldn't suggest going to theaters to watch it and paying money. That you could probably save your money and watch just about anything else. Maybe if it's on Netflix, if it's on cable, sure. Those seem amazing opportunities to watch The Dark Tower. I just don't think it's necessarily deserving of a ticket purchase, let alone watching it in theaters. And I think some of it begins with the emphasis on the villain. The thing with the Dark Tower series of books is that you don't really see the man in black. You don't really see the villain of the story because it's always centered around Roland and his quest to follow the beam to get to the tower. With the movie, the quest changes from getting to the tower to fighting the man in black. The man in black's quest changes from destroying the beam to destroying the tower. The major thing that changes because of this is the villain is more prominent. The problem with this is, like, when Stephen King was writing the books, he had The Lord of the Rings as inspiration, which is good inspiration. I mean, The Lord of the Rings is classic. But the villain of Lord of the Rings, Sauron, isn't particularly notable among the greatest villains of all time. He's more or less a footnote in his own story, because he's essentially just 100% evil. There's no character development to him. He's bad guy, wants to do bad things, and destroy the world because he's bad. And that's kind of what the Man in Black represents. He's the bad guy, he wants to do bad things and destroy the world, because that's what he represents. He doesn't seem to have any character motivation besides that, which Matthew McConaughey does a great job playing as bad guy who wants to do bad things and appearing cool while doing so, but at the same time it makes for a very boring villain. It makes for a villain that's kind of on par with some of Marvel's lesser offerings of villains, like Thor 2's villain, or the Guardian of the Galaxy, the first one's villain. Like, they don't really seem to have much going for them. And then there's the sliced up story, where you get like bits and pieces of the Dark Tower. You get bits and pieces of other Stephen King's books, including The Mist. Has some prominence in this movie. And I feel that if you haven't seen the movie The Mist, or you haven't read this short story it's based on, you might actually be a little confused by the story of the Dark Tower. There are other Stephen King things that kind of get tossed in there, like what's shown in the trailer is the Pennywise theme park, which does nothing for the story. It's just kind of there. It's just kind of like a fun little tie-in, especially considering it comes out in a month or so. But if you don't know it, you're not going to be confused. You're going to be like, oh, what's this abandoned theme park doing on a seemingly desert planet that probably shouldn't have real life stuff, that probably shouldn't have urban city stuff. And I feel like if people hadn't read the series, they might walk away from the film asking questions like, what on earth is a house ghost? Why do they have portals? What are they doing with kids? And how does that work? Like, if you've read the books, then you could be like, alright, I get an idea where they're using like the subplot using kids, but just watching the movie, everything's kind of glossed over. So the storyline kind of suffers from that. There was one part of the book that I was hoping to see in the movie, and it's probably the one that I remember the most. And it's that first line of The Gunslinger. That first line that goes, "The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed." It's a very simple, straight to the point. Lets you understand the scenario without necessarily knowing who the gunslinger is, or who the man in black is. And I was wondering if they were going to use that in the movie. And the movie opens up with a text crawl that tells you why the Dark Tower is under attack and why children are important. And then a little bit later, you hear the line, "The man in black fled into the desert." But it's already after the point where you discover that this version of the man in black is more or less unstoppable. So it doesn't make any sense within the context of the film. He doesn't seem to be the kind of character that's going to flee from anything. So the use of the line is like a callback that, once again, like the callback to The Mist, doesn't necessarily make sense. I was talking to a friend of mine what they could have done in regards to translating the movie. Because obviously in their time spent in the past, I believe it's 5 years or so since Ron Howard took up the project, they could have made it into a movie. He suggested that they could have made it into one large movie, and by that I mean the studios could have taken the first 3 novels and then converted that into one 3-hour film. His argument for that was that Stephen King likes to describe more than tell a story. And looking back, there's a lot of descriptive language that doesn't necessarily move the story forward. The gunslinger grunted a laugh and sat down with his back against one rude wall. How can a wall be rude? What does that even mean? Folded his arms and closed his eyes. After a little, the smell of roasting corn came to his nose. There was a pebbly rattle as Brown dumped a paper of dry beans into the pot. An occasional tack-tack-tack as Zoltan walked restlessly on the roof. He was tired. He had been going 16 and sometimes 18 hours a day between here and the horror that occurred in Tull, the last village. And he had been afoot for the last 12 days. The mule was at the end of its endurance, only living because it was a habit. Once he had known a boy named Shimi who had had a mule. Shimi was gone now. They were all gone. And there was only the 2 of them, him and the man in black. You could argue that some of that is... And that's the case with a lot of books. They tend to put in a lot of that extra descriptive language to get you in the mindset of that main character. So on one hand, I would kind of agree with him on that. On the other hand, I might argue that that's not the right step forward. On the other hand, I might argue that the studio spending $60 million on this high production, big action blockbuster adaptation was definitely the wrong choice in what to go towards. There are 2 solutions that I offer, and the first one is, at the very least, to start off with lower budget adaptations, somewhere in the $20 to $30 million range, which is still technically a lot of money, but it wouldn't be spent on big special effects. It would just be a lower budget adaptation of the first novel, as is, and then it could then proceed from there. Now, if somebody really wanted to do it right, now that we've got all of our different cinematic universes, build it around a Stephen King cinematic universe, considering all of the books that weave in and out of the Dark Tower franchise. Started off with a version of The Stand, where we meet the villain who becomes the Man in Black, and then go from there. At the very least, this version of the film, this version of the Dark Tower, is completely different to such a point that if you call another movie The Dark Tower, and you do another movie based on this series of books, there's a high likelihood that you will not repeat any content. But I suppose all of that's for another day. For now, though, there is a highly imperfect movie. At its best, it actually has pretty cool action, along with some pretty decent choreography. And then at its worst, it has everything else. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily terrible. It's not absolute crap. It's just mediocre. It's just a mediocre film with hints of greatness.